Hello, and welcome to another episode of Setting Precedents. I'm Steve Shlisky, the Activities and Programs Chair of the local chapter of NATAS.
And I am Randy Forsman. I'm the current president of the local chapter of NATAS. This is the San Francisco, Northern California. Steve, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing really well. We've sort of been on hiatus for a little while. Nice to hear you again.
Yes, it has. We actually recorded our first episode a year ago today. It is September 5th as we're recording this. You'll be hearing this a few days later. But yeah, a year ago was our first episode, and now we're on episode 4. So it's kind of nice to be back in the swing of things.
Yeah, and today we have a special guest, John Odell. He's written a book called Elmer and Virginia, a World War II romance and letters. And in case you don't know who John Odell is, he's a former president of our local chapter.
And not only that, he was also served as our secretary, as I did for several years. He was the awards chair, a vice president, and a trustee.
And while he was serving on the NATAS board, he was also a news editor, writer, producer, reporter for KGO. He's received 7 Emmy Awards, and his news team won a 1989 Peabody Award for coverage of the Loma Prieta earthquake.
And after KGO, he was a professor at the City College of San Francisco as well.
And it's special to have him here with us, and equally special that he shared the experience of his parents. John has traced early relationship of his parents through their letters back and forth. So without any further ado, let's get John on the phone here.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's call up John.
Hello.
Hey, John, Steve Shlisky and Randy Forsman.
John, how are you?
Hi, Randy. Hi, Steve. Good to hear
glad
from
you could join us.
And we're just talking about your book that's newly published.
The more talk, the better.
Yeah. So can you just give us an overview of what this book's about?
Well, this book is about history, but it's also about a romance, as the title suggests. And the title is Elmer and Virginia, a World War II romance in letters. And it's based on more than 700 letters that my parents wrote to each other from 1939 to 1944. And it began when my mother went off to college to Syracuse. They both grew up on Long Island in New York. And my father stayed home and started going to business school and got a job working for a bank. And this was the fall of 1939. They were both 17 years old when this book begins. Anyway, these letters sat in a closet for 50 some odd years. And after my parents passed, and when I had some time on my hand, I started reading them. I realized that they were outstanding. They were exemplary writing, and they really took you into what it was like to live during the Second World War.
I mean, I'm just doing the math a little bit. In 700 letters over 4 or 5 years, that's about a letter every 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of unbelievable the times we live in now. That sounds like a lot of letter writing.
Well, you have to realize that that's what they did. That was their form of communication, especially when my father went overseas. There was no phone calls. And even in the States, long distance phone calls were expensive. You almost had to make an appointment for them, especially after the war started. Writing was the way people kept in touch. If you went on vacation for a week, you were expected to at least send somebody back a postcard to let them know you were there. So it was the email of mid-20th century, I guess you'd call it.
Interested in the cast of characters here. Can you give a description of your father and your mother? You say they come from separate sides of the tracks.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what that means.
Well, my mother's father was a successful developer, Maynard Schill, his name. He had 6 kids, 5 girls and 1 boy. They lived in Hempstead, Long Island, in a nice house. They weren't extremely wealthy, but they were well-to-do. They were comfortable. Maynard developed large parts of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, for example. And my mother was, I think, the next to the youngest of the children. The only one to complete college, and the first person in her family to go to college. My father's father had been a trolley conductor. He had a grocery store for a while. He didn't have any more than an 8th grade education, like most people did at the time. And they had just sold a house earlier in 1939 because they couldn't pay the taxes or the mortgage. And so they sold this house and they moved into a bungalow cottage in a town called village called Roosevelt, which is one of the poorer communities on Long Island in Nassau County. And at the time, my grandfather, also John Odell, worked for Doubleday as a bindery foreman. So he did, from thence on, had steady employment, but he had an unsteady economic history, if you will, And my father was the younger of two children. His older sister, Evelyn, lived right across the street, actually, from my grandparents.
You have quite a lot of letters to go through. Did you learn anything about your parents that you maybe perhaps did not know growing up?
Well, I certainly got solid proof of the degree to which they loved each other. Me and my brother and sisters used to joke that they loved each other more than they loved us, which was probably a good thing. I didn't know that much about my parents. People didn't talk about the past. Aside from a few war stories that my father would tell, usually in the 50s when I was in grammar school, they didn't talk about that much. And there wasn't really much history. People weren't into genealogy yet and that sort of stuff. And so a person's past was their past. They lived in the present.
I'm wondering about compiling these letters and revealing intimacies about your life and so forth. How do you go about choosing what letters you include and choosing letters that maybe that's too intimate to share? What was your thought process about what to include?
Yeah, there weren't too many letters that were in that category, too intimate to share. Most of the things that I left out had to do with family affairs, day-to-day affairs, things that the general reader would have no interest in whatsoever. One of the things I did as a part of a research is looked at the genre of books on World War II letters to soldiers, and they were unfailingly dull and ubiquitous. There's thousands of them, it seems, and I wanted to make a book that was different than that. And so I chose the things that I chose had to do with explaining and developing their relationship and also their lives as they went along. My mother again, as an undergraduate at Syracuse University in New York, and my father as a bank clerk at Chase in Manhattan from the beginning. And then, of course, they diverged. My mother graduated from Syracuse in 1943, Phi Beta Kappa. She was the second woman editor of the Daily Orange, which is Syracuse's college newspaper. It's funny. I was looking at my brother has a copy of her yearbook, and I was looking at it, and they listed her as the second girl editor of the Daily Orange. Rather radical difference from today.
Maybe she was sort of a girl because they're growing up. They're going from being a teenager to a young adult through these letters. She was also, I guess, dating this guy named George at the same time. And so
there's growing up going on here. It gets real growing up after the war starts. She was weaning herself and being weaned by Elmer away from George. That's part of the story. But George is gone by the first quarter or whatever of the book, but it's interesting reading. One of the things my mother had in addition to the letters was she kept diaries in 1940 and half of 1941. And those were where most of the stuff about George takes place, is explained. And those diary entries, which I did transcribe, my editor had we paraphrased a lot of stuff from that for brevity. And that's one of the other features of the book is that I interject both commentary and filling in the blanks for where a verbatim reading of the letter would not be sufficiently interesting. This was too much chaff with the wheat. In addition to that, one of the other features of the book is that I have what I call historical milestones. So every couple of pages, there's a line that says, Germany invades Russia, or the Allies invade Sicily, things like that, milestones that give you kind of what I call a historical metronome in the background to the narrative of their lives going forward during that time.
You think your parents met at the 1939 graduation, from what I can...
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. Do you have a sense of, over the course of these 5 years, how they grew from being teenagers into adulthood?
You know, again, I didn't know them. All I know about them is from what they talk about to each other. And one of the things that comes through as things that attracted them to each other, aside from the dancing and the fun, was the integrity of each of them and the respect that each of them had for each other's integrity and humanity and honesty and forthrightness and work ethic and all of those things that make people successful. And they saw these things in each other. And they're written in this book. They talk about, I like you because you don't do this, you do this. I've never heard you say an unkind thing.
Another cute thing that's in the book is these little drawings that your mother did, like the jitterbug, and there's like a gloomy cloud that she's me in a gloomy cloud. I like the way she's illustrated some of it.
Yeah, and I guess going back, I never knew she could draw until I started reading these letters, because I don't remember her drawing anything when I was growing up.
Do you have any favorite passages that you would like to share with us?
Well, yeah, I thought I'd start with a little description of college life. This is 1939, and one of their rivals was Colgate University. And Colgate weekend, and the week before it was noisy but nice. They staged rip-roaring pep fests every night. And Saturday night, after we'd won 7-0, 3 cheers, all the alumni who came back to get drunk and all the students who stayed drunk for the occasion proceeded to wreck the city. One of the tricks for Colgate night is rent a hotel room and throw water bottles and other small or large objects down on the passersby. The streets around the hotels looked as if it had been raining, and it hadn't, except for the liquids the merrymakers had let fly. Gee, what a mess. The pep fests were almost as riotous, too. They poured gasoline in the trolley tracks and set them on fire. Very pretty sight. The little kiddies also bounced, yes, I said bounced, cars, which were parked along the street, out into the middle of the road and did various other things to keep the cops in complete frustration. These things are slightly crazy practices, but a lot of fun to watch. Just have to see that you don't get killed or wounded.
Wow, that's fantastic. That paints such a wonderful picture.
It does.
They were really skilled writers at this. I mean, they were writing letters to each other, but they were fantastic storytellers, it sounds like.
That's why I wrote the book, because I had the material.
Fantastic.
I didn't write the book. They wrote the book.
Yes, they wrote the book for you. Do you include any letters in their entirety from start to finish, or do you just include passages from letters?
I think maybe there's one letter that's in there in its entirety. And I'm not sure, because originally I had one letter in there in its entirety, and that may have gotten truncated or removed during the editing process.
Gotcha. Okay.
It seems like music really connected your parents together, not just big band music, which there's a lot in there about big band and the Lindy and swing music, but Toscanini and Tchaikovsky. What is it about music that tied your parents together?
Well, first of all, they were great dancers. My father's nickname was Crazy Legs Odell. He was an expert on the Lindy. In fact, some of the early letters my mother writes say, all the girls up here want you to come up and teach them the Lindy. Of course, the Lindy was actually formatted by Black Americans in Harlem during the 30s and named after Charles Lindbergh, the first person to solo an airplane across the ocean from New York to France. And so the big band era was in full swing. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller. And so dancing was a big thing. I think that's how my father won my mother over. The other thing that won her over, I think, was, as one of my mother's girlfriends said, Virginia was a very serious person, and Elmer made her laugh. And the expression around my house, I think, was the greatest gift that God can give a man is the ability to make women laugh. I know it's a little sexist, but whatever. The 78 record and AM radio were their connections to music. At first, AM radio with live broadcasts from New York City on Clear Channel bands. So in good weather, Virginia could get New York radio stations all the way up north in Syracuse, occasionally with a lot of static. And then as the popularity of a particular song rose, they were then pressed into 78 vinyl records.
The thing that I got from what little I've read of your book so far is that they would often talk about a particular piece of music that they were thousands of miles apart, but they would know the reference because it was played in the US and overseas in Europe. And it was easy to share something that was happening in real time.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Though I think most of the musical references take place before my father goes to Europe. They're in the early part of the relationship. They do reference music that they both knew, but it wasn't necessarily music that was new. was music that they had danced to, that they had stopped all dancing on a dance floor somewhere, like at Madison Square Garden. It's like they danced all night to whoever, Tommy Dorsey, whoever it was, and then ran out of gas on the way home.
Now, looking at your website, I'm noticing you have a jukebox section on there that has ways that you can listen to various music that is mentioned. When you just read a book, it's one thing, but to actually hear the music that is discussed kind of paints a much better, fuller picture.
Well, I think I originally had an idea that a digital version of this book would have those kinds of internet active links. And the Kindle format doesn't handle stuff like that. So that wasn't really a possibility. But after I'd put together the thin version of the book, and the thick version of the book was a couple of feet high, I went back and looked at all the references to music and looked up the URLs for the YouTube performances of that song. And so I kept a list. So we built the Jukebox. And it's a very interactive page. You open it up, and it has photographs of about a dozen of musicians, from Hazel Scott to Xavier Cugat to Artie Shaw, the Andrews sisters, and so forth. And when you mouse over them, it gives you the name of the performer, and you click on it, and it takes you down the page to where that song is. And that song is also accompanied by the text from the book that refers to that song.
And we'll have a link to that on this podcast. So scroll down, you'll find the link right to that Jukebox page.
One of the things I'm doing now to publicize the book is doing an on this day. I go through the manuscript. For instance, on August 15th, I posted 2 messages on Facebook and commercial Facebook and LinkedIn, I think, talking about my father shooting down 2 Messerschmitts on that day in 1944. With a photograph of the guy who was the flight leader for that mission. And then I also posted on that day in 1943, my mother wrote about listening to the music of Hazel Scott. And I'd never heard of Hazel Scott. You guys know Mike Clark, right? The photographer, KGO photographer. He posts on Facebook. He says, one of my best friends is a guy named Adam Clayton Powell III. Now, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a congressman from Harlem. A very famous person in the civil rights movement. Mike writes back and says, Hazel Scott was his mother.
Wow.
Wow.
So Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was married to Hazel Scott from 1945 to 1960. Adam Clayton Powell III wrote back, posted also that they're having a festival of Hazel Scott's music next year. So this kind of got this connection really nicely put together.
We should mention that your father was a fighter pilot.
Yeah, the legend was my father was coming home on the train from the bank to where he lived, and there was a guy on the train with a uniform on with wings on it, a U.S. Army Air Corps pilot. And my father said to myself, that's what I want to do. There was such a rush to train people, you kind of had to make an appointment to get your date to be inducted into the armed forces and go through all the health things and go through all the mental and physical tests. And then it was a 1-year process and this was most of 1943, that he went from being just a guy working in a bank to a guy flying the most famous and feared fighter aircraft in the Second World War, the P-51 Mustang. And so he flew 60 some odd missions over Europe. If you want, I'll read you a little excerpt from. Would you like that?
Please do, yeah.
That would be excellent.
He's writing about April 1st, 1944. The most awe-inspiring sight I know is to witness from about 25,000 feet the bombing of a large city. I was flying in a position where I could watch the whole show. First, the lead ship signals, and he's referring to the bombers, the American bombers. First, the lead ship signals that this is the run. The bomb bay doors open, and what seems to be ages later, tiny flashes appear on the toy town below. Almost immediately, these flashes bloom into puffs of smoke, and soon the whole town is obliterated. This may sound ruthless, but I feel good inside, knowing that somewhere far below, a factory that has been manufacturing war material to keep me away from you has received a major setback. We escorted the bombers halfway back across the continent, and then were relieved by another fighter group. You should have heard the guys grumble when we got home. was the longest mission in actual flying time, not distance, our group has ever flown. And we were mighty pissed off because no one had so much as seen an enemy fighter. You can't imagine what sitting cramped up in a fighter for a couple hours can do to you. Without a bit of an exaggeration, I couldn't walk for 10 minutes after I landed. My legs were actually paralyzed from poor circulation, cold, and working rudders. They're good as new in 15 or 20 minutes, though.
I love the little line of romanticism in that about how he sees it getting closer to her. You know, this idea of the bombing and destruction actually becomes a sort of love theme to her.
I'm doing something to people who are keeping me away from you.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to me. It's just the language that is used is so it doesn't sound like someone writing a letter to just one other person. It sounds like somebody writing a novel. It's just a wonderful flowing language they have, and it's paints the picture of what it's like.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know whether it was peculiar to my parents. Maybe it was, but the written word was how you communicated, other than speaking, or on the telephone occasionally.
And they're so eloquent at doing so.
Yeah, I was lucky. There wouldn't have been a book if they hadn't been eloquent, I'm sure.
That's true.
There are a couple of instances there where he mentions, I can't tell you, because he started telling my mother some things, and the brass said, and they actually made him write up a lecture on security to the squadron on censorship.
That's something the military did. They read all the letters and censored parts of it.
Especially in the beginning. In the beginning of the Americans coming over to Europe, because the Atlantic Ocean wasn't secured. The U-boats were still at loose. Later in the war, when they started being able to bring things over by airplane, those kinds of things loosened. So they weren't, I think maybe 2 or 3 of his letters had been opened. And one of them had the names of 2 of his squadron mates who had been killed in the few days prior to that. And the censors cut it out and then sent him a thing and slapped him on the wrist and said, don't do that. Don't do that no more.
As the war was kind of progressing, are there any instances of them talking about the conflict as it was becoming more relevant to the United States, like, say, the bombing of Pearl Harbor?
They did discuss Pearl Harbor. My father was a Republican, and he was, the United States was very isolationist in this time. And there's a passage from a poem by my father and a poem by Wilfred Owen about the First World War and how America felt like they had wasted all this blood to prop up a bunch of kings and regimes. Sound familiar? My father had just sent my mother a poem from the New York Herald Tribune about how John Bull was trying to get us back into the war. John Bull being the expression for the British. And after Pearl Harbor, he writes to her and says, I'm sorry I sent you that poem. I guess my attitudes have changed a little. And it wasn't the British that got us into the war, it was the Japanese. So there are things like that. There's a passage where my mother talks about the Germans invading Russia. And my mother says, well, it shouldn't take too long for the German panzers to make quick work of that. And I have an aside in it. I said her crystal ball wasn't working very well that day because it's generally considered the beginning of the end for the Third Reich.
Yeah, you don't attack Russia in the winter.
No, you don't. Have you ever read Harrison Salisbury's, I think it's called 600 Days or 700, I forget what it is. It's about the siege of Leningrad. It's absolutely incredible. And as Steve said, winter was the best ally the Russians had.
My parents, my dad was a businessman and my mom was an artist. And I look at my life and I look at who I am and I see pieces of both of them beside me. Do you have that sense that you're a composite of the two of them?
Mm-hmm. Well, I did want to fly airplanes. I actually was in the Naval Aviation program for a number of months. I soloed. I was flying an airplane called the T-28, which actually my father flew later on as well. And I had a heart murmur. They wouldn't let me fly their airplanes anymore. So I did go down that path. I never thought of myself as having any artistic instincts, but what I was, that I finally realized, was a visual thinker. And I ended up being a photo intelligence officer in the Navy during the Vietnam War. I tell people I spent my war counting trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is the truth, actually. And the way I got that job was after I couldn't fly anymore, they made me an intelligence officer. I was going to school. We had a class on interpreting photos, and they put this photo up of this craggy looking terrain. It could have been the Badlands of North Dakota or the Grand Canyon or someplace in Afghanistan, just real rugged terrain. And the instructor had everybody make a guess as to what it was. And then they all had those answered, and I raised my hand. I said, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but it looks to me like a blown up piece of tree bark. And everybody laughed. Odell, always cracking up. Of course, that's what it was. So I ended up being first a photo intelligence officer and then a video editor.
Where can people go to find more information in this book?
Well, they can go to my website, which is http whatever, elmerandvirginiabook.com. And there are links to buy that. You can order it from any bookstore and type in the ISBN. But of course, it's on Amazon. It's a soft cover book. It's a big book. It's more than 400 pages. There are 400, but not dense pages, I should say. It's also available on Kindle, an ebook. And the ebook has caption things for people who are reading impaired, so they can mouse over a photograph, say, have it tell them what the photograph is.
Well, the book has gotten some recognition. It was a finalist, I guess, took second place in National Independent Excellence Awards. It has 4 out of 4-star review from the Online Book Club and 5 out of 5-star review and gold medal from the Literary Titan.
Yeah.
Congratulations
Thank you
on those honors so far.
I'm just floored.
And hope, you said it's going to be a second volume. There's enough material left over for a second volume?
It's not a second volume. It would be a different book. It would be a book about growing up, because I grew up in Roosevelt. It would be a book about family, but I haven't really structured it quite yet to figure out how to make that a book about family and not about me and not about my family, but a book about what it was like to grow up in the 50s in New York, in the United States. So we'll see. Stay tuned. Not much of it has been written yet.
I'm very excited. They're such wonderful storytellers as you are, and I'm very, very excited to read this copy. You've definitely sold me on it. They remind me of my grandparents. My grandpa, Gus Forsman, he flew the hump in 1943 and 44. He joined the Air Corps about the same time that your father did, it sounds like.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was flying over the Himalayas, and my grandma was also enlisted. And I unfortunately don't have any letters they wrote back and forth to each other. So this is fascinating.
Well, the hump was something. One of my father's good buddies was a C-47 pilot and did the hump as well. Yeah.
It was a grueling flight. He would tell me about it. He was flying at 40,000 feet and with no cabin pressure and wearing thick, heavy jackets.
Yeah. Oh, it's cold up there. In fact, there's a joke from the South Pacific. If they wanted to get their beer cold, they put the cases in an airplane and fly it up to 20,000 feet for an hour.
That's funny.
Bring it back down. Anyway, I'll leave you with that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So thanks, John.
Thank you, John, for joining us.
Much success on this book and whatever you write in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. I enjoyed this immensely. Thank you.
Good. We're glad. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Excellent. Bye-bye.
What do you think you're looking forward to in reading this book?
Honestly, I really, just in the excerpts that he's shared, I was really impressed with just how well-spoken and eloquent his father's writing was, and it really paints the picture of exactly how things were. And I'm really excited to hear that perspective of two people in love through letters that didn't know that their letters would be published. It's a fascinating way to go about reading this story of two people that I've never met, but I feel like through their words that I will know them in a sense.
Seems to me a different experience than reading Facebook posts and social media posts. Letter writing was what people did in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, it really was. My grandparents, they also served in World War II, very similar to John's parents, but they didn't write letters quite back and forth the way that his parents did, or if they did not save any. So it's kind of neat. I think it's an era of American history that it is becoming more and more forgotten as time goes on, that people kind of take for granted. So I really applaud John for writing this book or compiling the letters for this book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Yeah, as am I. And just the whole idea of letter writing and that being a lost art, it's nice to have something that celebrates that sort of lost ability. That lost skill set.
Absolutely. So I'm hoping that we will get another podcast out here soon. This is our 4th episode in a year. We recorded our first one, as I mentioned earlier, a year ago today. So we want to get a little more consistent about recording these episodes and have more content to share with our NATAS members.
We're always looking for ideas for subjects and interviews and anything that would be of interest to our members. If you have any ideas, please email myself or Randy. You'll find our links to our email addresses on this page.
Absolutely. That's one of our goals, is to share the experiences of ourselves and our NATAS members across the board. So we would look forward to anybody who has an interesting topic to discuss, how it relates to our members, to reach out to us, because we'd love to have you on the show.
And look for us for a much more consistent basis.
Yes, absolutely. We'll start recording these a little more regularly soon. So stay tuned. The new episode will be up very shortly.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Steve. Spending this time.
Absolutely. And we will catch you all next time.
Great.